You ever have one of those days? The kind where you ride into town for a bag of flour and a box of nails, and you end up staring straight into the eyes of pure, unadulterated evil? That was Josiah Whitmore's day. He was 58 years old, with a face carved from granite by wind and sun, and hands that knew the language of rope, leather, and steel. He'd buried a wife, fought in a war, and built a ranch from dust and dreams. He thought he'd seen the worst of what men could do to each other. He was wrong. It was the silence that hit him first. Not a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, sick silence that hangs in the air before a storm. The town square, usually bustling with folks trading gossip and goods, was crowded but hushed. Men stood in a tight circle, their faces a mix of ugly curiosity and grim excitement. And in the center of that circle, on a rickety wooden platform, stood a girl. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her hair was the color of spun gold, but it was matted with dirt and tangled with bits of straw. Her dress was torn, a pale blue rag that did little to hide the bruises on her arms. But it was her eyes that stopped Josiah's heart. They were the color of a summer sky, but there was no light in them. They were hollowed out by a despair so deep it felt like a physical wound. Chains bound her wrists to a thick wooden post. They were heavy, rusted things, better suited for anchoring a ship than holding a person. Dried blood was caked around the iron cuffs where they'd bitten into her skin. A man with a greasy smile and a loud voice stood beside her, holding a wooden gavel. His name was Bartholomew, and he was the kind of man who profited from misery. "What am I bid for this prime piece of stock?" he bellowed, his voice slick with greed. "Strong back, willing hands. Guaranteed to handle any kind of work you have in mind, gentlemen." A wave of low, guttural laughter rolled through the crowd. Men nudged each other, their eyes crawling over the girl like insects. She flinched, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear into the rough wood of the post behind her. Josiah's hands, resting on the pommel of his saddle, tightened into fists. His knuckles turned bone white. This wasn't happening. Not here, not now. He'd fought a war to end this exact kind of barbarism. He'd watched friends die, believing they were building a better world, a world where people weren't sold like cattle. But as he looked at the girl, whose shoulders were trembling with silent, choked-back sobs, he realized something. Some wars never end. They just change battlefields. The bidding started low. $20, shouted a man with tobacco stains on his beard. $30, came another voice. The girl, whose name Josiah would later learn was Eleanor, kept her eyes glued to the dusty ground. Looking up, meeting the hungry gazes of the men bidding on her very soul, seemed to be a pain she could not bear. Each bid was a hammer blow against what little hope she had left. And watching it all from the side with a look of supreme satisfaction was another man. He wore a fine black coat and polished boots, a stark contrast to the dust and grime of the town. His arms were crossed, and a smug grin played on his lips. This was the man in charge. His name was Cain, and he was the architect of this nightmare. Flanked by 3 armed guards, he looked like a king surveying his grim kingdom. His men were not just thugs. They moved with a cold, professional efficiency, their hands never straying far from the pistols on their hips. They were there to ensure the business of selling human beings went off without a hitch. Josiah had a choice. He could turn his horse around, ride back to the quiet solitude of his ranch, and try to forget the haunted look in that girl's eyes. He could tell himself it wasn't his fight. He was just one man, old and tired. What could he do against a man like Cain, who had the town in his pocket and guns to back him up? But then he thought of Sarah, his late wife. He could almost hear her voice, as clear as a church bell on a Sunday morning. "You don't walk away from folks in need, Josiah. Not ever." Sarah would have charged in there without a second thought. She had a fire in her that could shame the devil himself. $60, going once, the auctioneer shouted, raising his gavel. Eleanor's legs seemed to give way for a moment, and she sagged against the post, the chains rattling with a sickening finality. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, and in that moment, something inside Josiah snapped. The quiet rancher, the man who kept to himself, was gone. In his place stood the soldier who had charged into cannon fire, the man who had promised his dying wife he would always stand for what was right. The fire he thought had long since burned out roared back to life, hotter and fiercer than ever before. And from the shadows of a nearby alley, a fourth man, one of Cain's, watched Josiah's face. He'd been watching the old rancher since he rode into town. He saw the shift in his eyes, the hardening of his jaw. He gave a subtle nod to Cain. The trap was set. The bait was on display. All they had to do was wait for the noble old fool to take it. What they didn't know was that Josiah Whitmore wasn't just a noble fool. He was a force of nature about to be unleashed. The air grew thick with tension. The gavel was in the air, about to fall. Time seemed to slow down, every heartbeat a drumbeat of doom. Was this how it ended for the girl with the sky-blue eyes? Sold off to the highest bidder, her life reduced to a number shouted in a dusty square? Just as the auctioneer's arm began its downward swing, a voice cut through the air, sharp and clear as a rifle shot. $100. The word echoed across the square, a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. Every head whipped around. The auctioneer's gavel froze, hovering in the air as if suspended by a string. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as they stared at the source of the impossible bid. It was Josiah. He sat tall on his horse, his face unreadable, his eyes locked on the girl. For the first time, Eleanor looked up. Her hollow eyes met his, and across the sea of shocked and angry faces, a tiny fragile spark of something flickered to life. It wasn't quite hope. It was more like the terrified disbelief of a person who'd forgotten what hope even felt like. Cain's smug grin faltered, disappearing for a fraction of a second before returning, wider and more predatory than before. This was it. The fish was on the hook. He whispered something to one of his men, who detached himself from the group and melted silently into the crowd, circling around behind Josiah. Josiah saw the movement from the corner of his eye, but his focus remained on Eleanor. He was making a silent promise to her, a promise he intended to keep no matter the cost. "Well now," Cain called out, his voice dripping with mock courtesy as he stepped forward. "Looks like we have a true gentleman in our midst. $100 is a princely sum, stranger. Are you quite sure you understand the merchandise you're bidding on?" Josiah swung himself down from his horse, his worn leather boots hitting the ground with a solid, definitive thud. Every step he took toward the platform felt heavy, deliberate. He was walking toward a cliff, and he knew it, but turning back was no longer an option. The crowd shuffled nervously, making a path for him. He could feel their eyes on him, a mixture of awe, pity, and contempt. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch that clinked with the sound of his life savings. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Josiah said, his voice low and steady, a rumbling counterpoint to Cain's slick tone. He began counting out the coins onto the auctioneer's table, the metallic ring of silver on wood a declaration of war. $100 for the girl's freedom. Cain let out a short, cold laugh that had no humor in it. "Freedom?" he purred, savoring the word like a fine wine. "My dear sir, who said anything about freedom? You're purchasing property just like any other man here. What you choose to do with your property, well, that's your business, isn't it?" The fragile spark in Eleanor's eyes dimmed. Her chains rattled as she shifted her weight, a desperate, unconscious movement toward the man who had bid for her, and away from the man who owned her. She'd been down this road before. A kind face, a promise of rescue followed by betrayal and a deeper pit of despair. She didn't dare to hope. Hope was a dangerous, painful thing. "Take off her chains," Josiah commanded, ignoring Cain and looking directly at the auctioneer. The command was not a request. It was an order, backed by a lifetime of hard-won authority. But Cain stepped between them, his friendly mask slipping away to reveal the viper underneath. "Now hold on there, friend," he said, his voice taking on a hard, dangerous edge. "There are procedures, paperwork to be filed. First, there's the town tax on your new acquisition, a mere $20. Then the handling fee, shall we say, 15s. And of course, the registration papers to make it all official." He was stalling, adding insult to injury, and they both knew it. He was playing with Josiah, testing his limits, enjoying the power he held over both the old rancher and the terrified girl. The crowd began to mutter. The spectacle was dragging on, and the tension was becoming unbearable. Josiah could feel the atmosphere shift. He'd been in enough barroom brawls and battlefield skirmishes to recognize the electric hum in the air just before violence erupted. Kane's men were subtly repositioning themselves, their casual stances becoming coiled springs of readiness. Their hands now rested directly on the butts of their guns. "How about," Josiah said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "we skip the paperwork." His own hand drifted down, his fingers hovering inches from the worn handle of his Colt revolver. "And you just let the girl go." Kane's eyes narrowed into slits. He was a predator who had just recognized that his intended prey was not a sheep, but a wolf in disguise. The old man's posture, the calm in his eyes, the practiced ease with which his hand found his weapon. This was not some soft-hearted farmer. This was a man who knew how to kill. Eleanor watched them, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd seen what Kane did to people who defied him. The last man who tried to intervene on behalf of a prisoner had been found in an alley a week later, his throat cut from ear to ear. This stranger, this brave, foolish old man, was walking that same path, and she couldn't even scream a warning. But Kane was a master of this game. He wasn't going to be drawn into a simple gunfight. His plans were always more intricate, more cruel. The smile crept back onto his face, a chilling, triumphant smirk. He gestured to his men, who now began to move in, forming a loose, inescapable circle. And in that sickening moment, Josiah understood. This was never about selling a girl. It was about catching a hero. The auction was just the bait. Eleanor was the lure. And he, Josiah Whitmore, had just swallowed the hook, line, and sinker. "You know what, stranger?" Kane said, his voice a venomous purr. "I like you. You've got spirit. I admire that. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to make you a proposition, a simple business deal." Josiah didn't take his eyes off Kane, but his senses were screaming. He tracked the three gunmen in his peripheral vision. They were no longer just surrounding him. They were flanking him, cutting off every possible angle of escape. These were not common thugs. They moved with the coordinated precision of soldiers, or a wolf pack closing in for the kill. "What kind of proposition?" Josiah asked, his voice dangerously calm. Kane gestured with a lazy flick of his wrist toward a large, imposing brick building across the square. The sign above the door read, "Commonwealth Bank and Trust." "You see that bank?" Kane began, his voice taking on the confidential tone of a man sharing a grand secret. "Someone's been discouraging my customers, spreading vicious rumors that my business isn't entirely legitimate. Now that hurts my reputation. And when my reputation gets hurt," he paused, letting the threat hang in the air, "I tend to do things that make other people very, very sorry." Eleanor's face, already pale, turned the color of ash. She knew what was coming. She'd seen this twisted game before. Kane didn't just deal in human misery. He was an extortionist, a tyrant who ruled through fear. The bank manager had likely refused to pay Kane's protection fees or had threatened to contact the law about the slave auctions. This wasn't just a rescue attempt anymore. Josiah had stumbled into the middle of a war for the soul of the entire town. "So here's the deal," Kane continued, pulling a folded piece of paper from the inner pocket of his coat. "It's simple. You're going to walk into that bank. You're going to hand the teller this little note. You'll wait patiently while they gather what's written on it. Then you'll walk back here. We'll conclude our business with the lovely Eleanor, and everyone will go on their merry way. See? Simple." Josiah took the note. He didn't need to open it to know what it was. It was a demand for money, a robbery note. Kane was trying to make him an accomplice, to drag him down into the same filth he wallowed in. If he did it, he'd be a criminal. If he refused, he glanced at Eleanor. Her chains had worn her wrists raw. She was favoring one leg, as if standing for so long was an agony. How many days had she stood on this platform? How many towns had she been paraded through? The thought of leaving her to Kane's mercy was a poison in his gut. It was a choice between his soul and her life. "And if I refuse?" Josiah asked, his voice flat. Kane's smile stretched into a terrifying grin. "Well, now that would complicate things, wouldn't it? My boys here," he gestured to his gunmen, "they get awfully bored just standing around. Their trigger fingers get itchy. And this girl," he ran a finger down Eleanor's tear-stained cheek, making her recoil violently. "She's seen a bit too much, I think. It might just be easier for everyone if we wiped the slate clean and started fresh with a new batch of inventory tomorrow. The threat was unmistakable. He wasn't just selling Eleanor. She was a witness. If Josiah didn't play along, Cain would murder them both right here in the town square, and the complicit crowd would simply melt away, pretending they'd seen nothing. The few honest folks left in the square had already vanished, finding urgent business elsewhere. They were alone. Josiah's mind was a whirlwind of calculations. He was a good shot, but not good enough to take down 3, maybe 4, trained gunmen before one of them put a bullet in Eleanor. He was cornered, outmaneuvered, and trapped. He unfolded the note. It was worse, so much worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just a robbery. It was a frame-up, elegant in its cruelty. The note demanded $500 from the bank's vault, and it was signed with his name, Josiah Whitmore. Cain had never asked his name. He had never offered it. This was a meticulously planned execution. They hadn't just been waiting for any hero to step forward. They had been waiting for him. "How do you know my name?" Josiah asked, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture of pure evil. Cain chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of triumph. "Josiah Whitmore, owner of the Double W Ranch, 20 miles north of here. A widower, lost his wife Sarah to the fever 2 years ago. A decorated war hero. Keeps to himself. You're not a ghost, old man. I make it my business to know everyone of substance in this territory. I know who has money, and more importantly, I know who has a conscience. A conscience is a weakness I can exploit." Eleanor listened, a new wave of horror washing over her. This wasn't random. This was personal. Cain had researched his target, found his vulnerabilities, and constructed this entire scene to break him. He'd done the same thing to her father. Learned he was in debt, then used that debt to blackmail him before finally murdering him and taking her. This was Cain's signature move. He didn't just destroy people, he dismantled their lives piece by piece first. "And here," Cain said, gesturing grandly as if explaining a magic trick, "is the beautiful part. You walk into that bank. You hand them that note signed with your name. They'll assume you're making a legitimate withdrawal from your account. But I've already sent a message to the sheriff, a concerned citizen, reporting that a desperate old rancher, grieving his wife and facing financial ruin, might be planning something rash." The sheriff, of course. The law in this town wasn't just turning a blind eye. It was an active participant in Cain's schemes. The trap wasn't just closing, it had been closed from the start. "When you walk out of that bank with the cash," Cain continued, his eyes gleaming with sadistic pleasure, "the sheriff will be waiting. He'll arrest you for bank robbery. You'll be tried and you'll be hanged. The bank will foreclose on your ranch to cover its losses. I get the money, your land, and one less do-gooder in my territory. Clean, simple, tidy." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, and the girl, poor terrified Eleanor? She'll be my star witness. She'll tell the court how you, in your desperation, kidnapped her and forced her to be your accomplice. Of course, after the trial, witnesses can be so unreliable. They have a tendency to disappear, especially pretty ones. It was a perfect trap, a masterpiece of malevolence. Go into the bank, and he's a condemned man. Refuse, and he and Eleanor die right here. There was no way out. He was checkmated. Or was he? He looked at Eleanor again. She wasn't just standing there in terror. Her eyes were darting frantically toward the narrow alley behind the bank. It wasn't a random glance. It was a message. She was trying to tell him something. He followed her gaze and saw it. A flicker of movement in the shadows. A fifth gunman, cutting off the last possible escape route. "Time's wasting, Whitmore," Cain said, theatrically pulling a gold pocket watch from his vest. "The sheriff makes his rounds in 10 minutes. So what's it going to be? Are you going to be a bank robber, or are you going to be a corpse?" Josiah's mind raced. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but Sarah's voice echoed in his memory again. "Sometimes, Josiah, the only way to win an unfair fight is to change the game entirely." He folded the note, his movements slow and deliberate, and tucked it into his pocket. A strange calm settled over him. All right, Kane, he said, his voice level. I'll do it, but on one condition. Kane raised a skeptical eyebrow. You're in no position to be making conditions. Maybe not, Josiah replied, taking a step closer, forcing Kane to meet his gaze. But I know something you don't. Something about that bank. Something that's going to make your perfect little plan blow up in your face. Eleanor held her breath watching the two men. She had no idea what Josiah was doing. But for the first time in weeks, that tiny spark in her chest began to glow a little brighter. She saw a flicker of doubt, of uncertainty in Kane's eyes. It was the first crack in his armor of absolute control. The predator was, for the first time, unsure of his prey. Kane's confidence, so absolute just moments before, wavered. He was a man who hated surprises, who controlled every variable. The idea that there was something he didn't know was like a stone in his shoe. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, his curiosity overriding his caution. What are you talking about, old man? Spit it out. Josiah glanced around, a calculated theatrical gesture to ensure Kane's men couldn't overhear, pulling the villain deeper into his web. That bank isn't just holding farmer savings, Kane, he said, his voice barely audible. They've been moving federal money, Army payroll. It comes through on an armored coach once a month, destined for the fort up north. And guess what? Josiah let a small, grim smile touch his lips. Today is delivery day. The color drained from Kane's face. Local sheriffs and bought-off judges were one thing, but the United States Army was another beast entirely. Stealing from the federal government wasn't just a crime, it was an act of war. It brought in federal marshals, military tribunals, and hangman's ropes that couldn't be loosened with bribes or threats. If Josiah was telling the truth, Kane's tidy little plan was about to bring the full, unforgiving weight of the U.S. government down on his head. Eleanor saw the shift in Kane. He was rattled. Josiah wasn't just fighting back, he was changing the very nature of the battle. He was buying them time, precious seconds, but she didn't know for what. She'd heard the men talk. They never stayed in one place for long. They'd hit a town, bleed it dry, and move on before the law could ever catch up. But federal marshals were a different story. They didn't stop. Ever. You're lying, Kane hissed, but the conviction was gone from his voice. It sounded more like a desperate hope than a statement of fact. Am I? Josiah countered, pressing his advantage. Look over there. He gave a subtle nod toward the bank. See the 2 extra guards on the porch? They weren't there an hour ago. Count the horses hitched behind the building. That's a cavalry escort, Kane. And see how the bank manager keeps pacing by the window, checking his watch? Does that look like a normal Tuesday morning to you? Kane's eyes darted to the bank, his sharp mind racing, processing the new information. The extra guards, the horses. He could see them. It was real. Josiah wasn't just bluffing. He was pointing out facts Kane had been too arrogant to notice. The smart play was to cut his losses, call it a day, and ride out of town before a troop of uniformed soldiers came looking for trouble. But his pride, his vanity, was at stake. He had invested weeks in this scheme, in the public humiliation and destruction of Josiah Whitmore. To back down now in front of this crowd, in front of his own men, was unthinkable. Even if you're telling the truth, Kane said slowly, his mind twisting, trying to find a new angle. It doesn't change a thing for you. You still have 2 options. Do what I say, or watch her die. But Josiah had anticipated this. He had gambled on Kane's greed and pride being stronger than his common sense. Actually, Josiah said, his voice hardening, there's a third option. You unlock her chains, you and your men get on your horses, and you ride away. You disappear, and nobody has to explain to a U.S. Marshal why a slave auction was being held in the middle of his territory on the same day the Army payroll went missing. It was a brilliant move. He was offering Kane an escape, a way to save face while also saving their lives. Eleanor felt a surge of adrenaline. This could work. It could actually work. But she could also see the growing agitation in Kane's men. They'd been on a hair trigger for too long. The standoff was making them nervous. One of them kept glancing down the street toward the sheriff's office, as if he was more afraid of what was coming than of the old man in front of them. That's when the situation took a dark, irreversible turn. The sheriff appeared, but he wasn't alone. He was walking side by side with Captain Morrison of the United States Cavalry. Kane hadn't sent for the sheriff, and Josiah hadn't sent for the cavalry. They were just here. Kane's bluff and Josiah's counterbluff had just collided with cold, hard reality. And no one knew who was on whose side. Kane, seeing his window of opportunity closing, made his move. He pulled his gun, but he didn't point it at Josiah. He pressed the cold steel barrel to Eleanor's temple. "Nice try, old man," he snarled, all pretense of civility gone. "But I have a rule: I never, ever leave witnesses." The click of the hammer being pulled back was the loudest sound in the world. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, a prayer forming on her lips. Josiah's hand flew to his gun, but he knew he was too slow. He was a dead man. She was a dead girl. Evil had won. But then another sound echoed across the square. It was the sharp, authoritative voice of Captain Morrison. "I would strongly advise against that course of action, sir." Kane froze. The sheriff froze. Everyone froze. 6 blue-coated cavalrymen had dismounted, their rifles held at the ready, forming a perfect, deadly semicircle around the platform. They hadn't just stumbled into town. They were here for a reason. Josiah's bluff about the army payroll hadn't been a bluff at all. It had been the God's honest truth. The game had just changed, again. Captain Morrison was a man carved from the same moral bedrock as Josiah. He took in the scene in an instant. The chained girl, the armed thugs, the terrified townsfolk, and the man with the gun to the girl's head. His face was a mask of cold fury. "What in the name of God is going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. Kane, ever the actor, tried to recover, plastering a sickly smile on his face. "Just a minor business dispute, Captain. A simple debt collection. Nothing that requires the attention of the U.S. Army." But Morrison wasn't looking at Kane. His eyes were on Eleanor, on the raw, bleeding wounds on her wrists. He'd seen those kinds of wounds before, on the wrists of men and women freed from plantations in the South. He knew exactly what this was. "Debt collection?" Morrison repeated, his voice dripping with ice. "Does collecting a debt typically involve chaining a woman to a post in a public square?" Josiah saw his opening. "Captain," he said, stepping forward slowly, his hands raised to show he was no threat. "This man, Kane, is a slaver. He's been kidnapping and selling people across this territory for months." "That's a slanderous lie," Kane shouted, his composure finally cracking. "This girl is an indentured servant who violated her contract." But it was too late. Morrison wasn't listening. He gave a sharp nod to one of his men. "Sergeant, cut her loose." As the sergeant moved forward with a pair of heavy bolt cutters, one of Kane's men twitched, his hand moving toward his gun. In a flash, Morrison's saber was in his hand, the tip leveled at the gunman's throat. "I would not," Morrison said, his voice deadly quiet. The gunman froze, sweat beading on his forehead. The sergeant snapped the heavy chains. Eleanor stumbled forward as the weight fell away, and Josiah was there to catch her, supporting her as the reality of her freedom washed over her in a dizzying wave. She was safe. She was actually safe. Kane knew it was over. His entire operation, his carefully constructed kingdom of fear, was crumbling around him. He saw the federal prison, the hangman's noose. He saw the end. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, backing away toward his horse. "I have legal papers for all my transactions." "Then you won't mind presenting them to a federal judge," Morrison said, turning his cold gaze on Kane. "Sergeant, place this man under arrest." And that's when Kane made his final, fatal error. Instead of surrendering, he gambled. He spun around, shoving Eleanor hard into Josiah, using her as a momentary shield. He fired a wild shot, not at the soldiers, but at the sheriff, who stood there looking stunned and useless. The sheriff went down, clutching his leg. In that single moment of chaos, Kane made a break for it. The square erupted. Kane's gunmen opened fire on the cavalry. The soldiers returned fire with disciplined, lethal precision. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Josiah shoved Eleanor to the ground behind the heavy wooden post, shielding her with his own body as bullets ripped through the air above them. Through the smoke and screams, he saw Kane leap onto his horse, leaving his men to die for him. He was a coward to the very end. But Captain Morrison was faster. He raised his own rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot was perfect. Kane screamed as the bullet tore through his shoulder. He slumped forward in the saddle, but with a final, desperate effort, he spurred his horse and galloped out of town, a wounded animal fleeing the hunters. Two of Kane's men were dead in the dust. The other two had thrown down their guns and were surrendering. The gunfight had lasted less than 30 seconds. As the acrid smell of gunpowder cleared, Josiah helped a shaking Eleanor to her feet. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. She could only nod, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief. The nightmare, it seemed, was finally over. Captain Morrison approached them, his face grim. "Miss, my apologies for what you've endured. We had intelligence that this ring was operating in the area, but we never expected to find them in plain sight." He pulled out a notebook. "Can you tell us your name?" "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse and fear. "Eleanor Hartwell. They took me from my family's farm 6 weeks ago. They killed my father." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the act of bearing witness giving her a strength she didn't know she possessed. Josiah felt a new wave of cold fury. This wasn't just slavery, it was murder. It was wholesale destruction of families. "Miss Hartwell," Morrison asked urgently, "do you know if he has other prisoners? A base of operations?" Eleanor's eyes lit up with a sudden, fierce urgency. "Yes, a camp, hidden in a canyon, about 5 miles east of here. There are others. A dozen, maybe more. Women, children. They're guarded." Morrison's face hardened. "Sergeant," he barked at his men, "take half the troop and ride for that canyon. Now." But as the soldiers mounted up, a terrible thought struck Josiah. A thought so cold it froze the blood in his veins. Kane wasn't just fleeing. A wounded, cornered animal doesn't run aimlessly. It runs to its lair. He was riding east. "Captain!" Josiah shouted, his voice ringing with alarm. "Kane isn't running away. He's heading for the camp. If he gets there before your men—" The horrifying implication hung in the air. A desperate man with nothing left to lose. A dozen witnesses who could testify to his crimes. Kane wasn't going to the camp to hide. He was going there to erase the evidence. Permanently. "My God," Morrison breathed, the color draining from his face. He understood immediately. Kane would slaughter them all. "Change of plans," he roared. "All of you, ride! Ride like the devil is on your heels. I'll be right behind you." He turned to Josiah. "You, old man, you can shoot." Josiah just nodded, checking the rounds in his Colt. "Then you're deputized. You're with me." He looked at Eleanor. "Miss Hartwell, for your own safety, you should stay here." But the terrified girl who had stood on that platform was gone. In her place was a woman forged in the fires of hell, and she was not about to let her friends suffer the same fate she had so narrowly escaped. "No," Eleanor said, her voice ringing with unshakable resolve. "Those people in that canyon are my family now. We survived together. I am not leaving them behind. I know the layout of that camp. I know where the guards post themselves. I know who is too sick or too young to run. You need me." Captain Morrison looked at her, saw the steel in her eyes, and knew she was right. "All right," he said with a grim nod. "But you stay close, and you do exactly as I say. Understood?" They mounted up, a strange trio, the soldier, the rancher, and the survivor, and spurred their horses east, chasing a wounded devil, racing against time, fire, and death itself. The ride was a blur of pounding hooves and choking dust. Every minute that passed was another minute Kane had to carry out his monstrous plan. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the canyon, their worst fears were realized. A thick column of black smoke was rising into the clear blue sky. The camp was on fire. Down below it was chaos. Figures were running, screaming. Gunshots echoed off the canyon walls as the first of Morrison's men engaged the remaining guards. And in the center of it all, standing before a large, crude wooden barracks, was Kane. His coat was stained dark with his own blood, his face a mask of insane fury. In his good hand, he held a lit torch. Eleanor gasped in horror. The barracks. That's where they keep the ones who are too weak to work. They're chained to the walls inside. Without a word, without waiting for an order, Josiah spurred his horse, charging down the treacherous canyon slope. He was no longer a rancher. He was the angel of vengeance. Eleanor and Morrison were right behind him, their faces set in grim determination. Kane saw them coming. With a final roar of defiance, he hurled the torch onto the dry timber roof of the barracks. The building went up like a tinderbox, flames erupting into the sky. Desperate, muffled screams began to come from within. Kane turned to make his final stand, raising his pistol, but his wounded shoulder made his aim unsteady. He fired, the shot going wide. Before he could fire again, Josiah was on him. He launched himself from his saddle, tackling Kane with the force of a grizzly bear. They hit the ground hard, rolling in the dust, a whirlwind of desperate, violent motion. But Kane, weakened by his wound and a life of soft living, was no match for the raw, righteous strength of the old rancher. The fight was short and brutal. It ended with Kane on his stomach, his face pressed into the dirt, and Josiah's boot on his neck. While Josiah subdued the monster, Morrison and Eleanor raced to the burning barracks. The soldiers were already there, hacking at the door with axes. Eleanor, shouting directions, pointed out a weak spot in the wall she had noticed during her captivity. They smashed through it, and a wave of smoke and heat billowed out. One by one, they began pulling people out of the inferno. Gaunt, terrified men, women clutching crying children, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes wide with the disbelief of the saved. Families who had been torn apart were reunited in the dusty, bloody clearing, their sobs of grief turning into tears of joy. It was a scene from the very depths of hell, transformed into a moment of divine salvation. As the last prisoner was pulled from the collapsing, flaming building, federal marshals, summoned by Morrison before he'd even ridden into town, arrived to take custody of Kane and his surviving men. As they dragged him away in chains, the same kind of chains he had put on so many others, Kane looked at Josiah, his eyes burning with a venomous, uncomprehending hatred. "Why?" he rasped, his voice choked with dust and defeat. "Why you? It was just business. I did my research. You were just a lonely old man on a worthless patch of rock. Why risk it all for her?" Josiah looked from the smirking, defeated face of Kane to the tearful, grateful face of Eleanor, who was helping a young mother wash the soot from her child's face. And in that moment, he finally understood the full, terrible truth. He looked back at Kane. "My land," Josiah said, the realization dawning on him. "It wasn't about the money. It was never about the girl. You wanted my ranch." Kane's defeated expression twisted into a final, triumphant sneer. "The railroad is coming through," he spat. "Your worthless patch of rock is the only viable pass through the mountains for 50 miles. My client pays very well for land cleared of obstacles. You were just an obstacle." The whole elaborate sadistic theater, the auction, the frame-up, the psychological torture, it had all been a monstrous, overcomplicated scheme to legally steal his home. He had been targeted from the very beginning. It was a chilling revelation, a glimpse into a mind so twisted it preferred to build a cathedral of cruelty rather than simply knock on a door and make an offer. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple, Eleanor found Josiah as he was preparing his horse for the ride home. The rescued prisoners were being tended to by the soldiers, their journey back to civilization about to begin. For Eleanor, a new life awaited, perhaps back east, far from the memories of this harsh and beautiful land. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice quiet but strong. "Thank you isn't a big enough phrase for what you did." Josiah finished tightening his saddle cinch and turned to face her. He looked at this young woman who had endured the unthinkable and had emerged not broken, but stronger. He saw the same fire in her that he had loved in his Sarah. "No thanks needed, Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "You just go on and live a good long life. Live it free. That'll be thanks enough for the both of us." He tipped his hat to her, a simple gesture of respect from one survivor to another, swung himself into the saddle, and rode away without looking back. People in that territory would tell the story for generations. The story of the quiet old rancher who rode into town for nails and ended up dismantling a slaver's empire. They talk about his courage, his impossible bid, his clever bluff, and his final desperate charge into the flames. But for Josiah Whitmore, riding toward the silhouette of his home against the twilight sky, it was much simpler than that. He had made a promise to his wife, a promise to stand up against the darkness. Today he had kept that promise. Evil had been met, innocence had been freed, and in a world that often felt broken beyond repair, he had proven that sometimes all it takes is one good person in the right place at the right time to make all the difference. If this story reminded you that there's still good in the world, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next adventure. And let me know in the comments, what do you think was going through Cain's mind when he saw that single old rancher refuse to back down? I read every single comment, and I can't wait to hear your take. Until next time, stay safe and don't be afraid to be the one who stands up.